On Perspective today, there's budget reform, the 20 million health overspend, hospital beds, dyslexia and reform of government's land ownership, all of which were discussed in June Tynwald. We'll hear later about getting health spending back in line with budgets, but first, is government rushing its hurdles over changes to how it manages its property? Laurie Hooper certainly thinks so.
Part of the job of being an MHK, as you know, is to stand up and scrutinise things, and sometimes that means supporting what the government's doing, sometimes it means challenging what they're doing, and sometimes you fall somewhere in the middle where you're supportive of what they're trying to do, but you have questions, unanswered questions and concerns about the way they're going about doing it. And I would put this transfer of functions around government land into that category, because I wrote to a select committee back in 2017, 2018 suggesting we put all government property in one place. The idea being, if you centralise all your commercial property, you've got one team, one contact point for the private sector who are renting, it makes it easier, you can probably get more out of your assets that way. And I've always been very supportive of that. But then when they bring forward this transfer of functions order, we're establishing a new statutory board with all sorts of powers, and not doing that through a bill, doing it through a transfer of functions order, a single piece of statutory legislation, a single sitting, feels like it's being rushed. And then when you look through the detail of that, it raises a lot of unanswered questions about how some of this stuff is going to work. And partly that's because they've decided to do it all at once in one big fell swoop, rather than in stages to test the water and make sure it works properly. And when you're trying to do everything quickly, inevitably there will be things that you've missed or things that you haven't properly thought through. And that's kind of the feeling I've got from talking to people involved in the project, is there's still lots of bits of work that haven't been completed. And it's not anyone's fault, it's just because they're being asked to do a lot of work very quickly. And that's why a lot of the questions have been unanswered. I mean, I've had a lot of engagement back and forth with the drafter, for example, and his responses have been helpful, but incomplete. And he's acknowledged that openly, because he doesn't have enough time, really. Since we had the briefing, I think it was last Friday, the Treasury finally reached back out to me, and it was the Monday that we actually ended up talking then about this. So it was very, very tight timescales in order to have conversations before the sitting on the Tuesday and the Wednesday when we actually debated it. And I think that's the issue, is it's ministers' job to explain what they're doing, to make sure that members are comfortable enough to vote yes or no, and asking us to vote for something that ministers themselves don't seem to fully understand. I think it's a step too far, especially in this case, because there is no rush. They're trying to set up this new statutory board, and it's not going to be in existence till next April. That's what the order says. So there's no need to rush this through. There's no need to do this at pace. They can work over the summer, they can answer the questions that need answering, they can satisfy themselves everything is going to work properly, they can deal with some of the issues that have been raised, and then they can bring it back to a new Tynwald, a new House of Keys, and they can get it approved in October, November, and it still hit their April deadline. So it's one of those situations where it feels like the political pressure to push this, to get it done before the election, is very much about politics, not about what's doing what's right. And this is where I think there's some issue, because obviously there are those of us, and I'm not alone in this, who are very supportive of what they're trying to do, but are very concerned about the way they're going about doing it.
It's not, though, a bad thing in principle to try and drive things forward, to push things, and goodness only knows the Isle of Man government hasn't been it doesn't have a long list of achievements from this last 5 years, so trying to get a few things over the line before the recess after July isn't necessarily a bad thing.
No, it's not. I'd agree with that. The drive is good, but you don't rush things for the sake of it, and I would rather them not rush and get it wrong, because we're dealing here with all the government land, and that doesn't just include the commercial properties and government offices, it includes the glens, it includes all the public open spaces that the government own, but it also includes public sector housing. There are 1,200 or so tenants in DOI properties, plus then all the local authorities. Now, the government have insisted that this isn't going to change the way that is managed, and unfortunately that's not the way it looks when you read the order. There's a line in there, for example, that says that the new government estate authority will have to approve rents that the DOI set. Now, anyone that's had any involvement with housing knows that the way the rents are set at the moment is local authorities are consulted, they make a recommendation to the department makes a decision, because it applies the same rent then to its housing as it does to all the local authorities. What the government are proposing is that this new authority actually gets the final say, and so it won't be the department that approves it. The department will have to approve local authority rents, and because then they need to set their rent, that needs to go to the GEA, and we all set the same rent. And so inevitably body, this means this new authority will have de facto approval over local authority public sector rents. Now, I would ask, have the local authorities been told that this is about to happen? I don't think so. To my understanding is they haven't, because they've not been engaged. And this kind of thing, it's, well, hold on a second, is that a good thing to have an extra layer? Who knows?
So in effect then, the new body is going to have to have a really in-depth understanding of the whole way in which public sector housing is managed across the island.
I think that's true, but not just housing. It's going to have an in-depth knowledge of how all of its land is being managed and overseen, and be comfortable that they're handing a lot of that risk back to departments, whilst they are carrying the risk of not knowing, for example, what land they are actually responsible for. Because if you ask government, give us a list of all your land, the answer is, we probably can't do that. We don't know what we own in terms of everything. And that's quite worrying in itself. But also then you look at the state of the government estate. I mean, Ramsey Hospital's a great example of this. Not been maintained properly, and now there's a massive bill come due. So what we're asking this new authority to do is to take on all the risk for the whole government estate that hasn't been maintained properly. What is that maintenance deficit? How much are they inheriting? What's that cost going to be? And whilst it's all kind of hidden within departments, no one really knows, no one really can answer that question. But if I'm on that board, the very first question I'm asking is, what do we need to spend to bring the estate up to scratch? And I suspect that would be quite a large number. And again, that hasn't really been thought about in terms of how they're going to manage this new authority and this new relationship. And that isn't a drafting issue, that is a policy question. And this is where some of the problems have arisen, because some of the issues that I and I think others have got are to do with the way that the order has been drafted. So there are questions, unanswered questions about the wording in the order and what it means. But there are also some big policy questions that appear to have been made, policy decisions that appear to have been made, but there's been no explanation for why they've been made. I mean, one example is that at the moment the government property trustee is responsible to Tynwald. That's what the law says. They're changing that in the order and making the property trustee responsible to the council of ministers. Why are they making that change? It could be a technical change, but the government haven't explained that it's happening. They didn't mention it to us in any of our briefings. They didn't mention it on the floor. It's something that is definitely going to occur. But what does that mean in terms of oversight if the chair of this body can stand up when questioned in Tynwald and say, thank you very much, but actually statutorily I'm accountable to the Chief Minister, I'm not accountable to Tynwald Court? What does that mean in practice? I don't know. And this is what I mean about the number of unanswered questions. And by this stage, if you want to set up a new statutory authority that's going to have responsibility for all government land and property, going to have a multi-million-pound a year budget to be spent, it's going to be responsible for a big chunk of the capital programme as well. At this stage, we shouldn't have unanswered questions around some of the basic stuff.
And there will be lots of examples. I mean, I have an example here. When I was DEFRA Minister, we struck a deal with Isle of Man Mart to ensure that we had a continuation of a Mart facility on the island, and we offered peppercorn rent because there was a very strong policy reason why we needed a Mart in the island, basically a place where farmers could bring their animals for sale, and it would allow them a chance to get a feel for where the market was in terms of prices. It wouldn't have worked if we'd have charged the full commercial rent. So I guess there'll be lots of examples of policy decisions taken for very sound, in this case, agricultural reasons, but it could be educational reasons, charity purposes, whatever it might be, which won't be necessarily good, sound property management principles.
Yeah, and that's a fair question. So we've been told by the government that they'll have this multi-tiered management framework, and I think a question was asked by one of the LegCo members about, well, if we're relying so much on that, surely we need to see that before we approve the order. And I think that's a fair point, because if we are asking this new authority to operate on a more commercial basis, well, how do you make sure that those policy carve-outs exist, especially when the actual legal responsibility will sit with this body? And this is a point I've flagged with the team already, is this is going to be a political body. It'll have a Tynwald member as a chair, Tynwald member as a vice chair, responsible to Comyn. So what happens when those Tynwald members are at odds with the minister? So if the minister says, I need to give these guys a peppercorn rent because it's really good for the environment, very good for our agriculture, it's good for our economy, brilliant. What if the chair of this new body says, yeah, but actually I am the legal owner of this building and I have a mandate from the Council of Ministers that says I have to generate a profit on all my assets? How are we going to resolve that? And is it going to be up to Comyn to resolve every single one of these differences? And if that's the case, we need to look back on the track record that we have of government and Comyn mediating these interdepartmental disputes and ask, is that a a successful, effective measure? And the answer is it really isn't, actually. We see that every day. I mean, Park Road is a great example. It's been empty for a decade, I think, near enough, all because two government departments couldn't agree what to stick on the site, and Comyn never got round to giving them a decision. And essentially, that kind of issue happens quite a lot when you have two departments, two ministers, two bodies in conflict. But usually their conflict is because they have different wants, different objectives, and that's what we're doing here as well, is creating a new body with its own set of objectives, of wants, of needs, of metrics, and then you are creating this additional tension. And that's not a drafting question, it's not a legal question, that's a political question. And I don't feel that the politics, the context of the island has been properly considered when they've put this together. They've gone away, they've thrown something together that might work in theoretical terms, but actually the moment that is going to connect with reality, you're going to have problems, and the system is just not going to function. And I think if you can see that now going in, we should probably fix that now, rather than setting it up, letting it fail, and then looking back and going, well, if only we'd have known this 6 months ago.
That was Ramsey MHK Laurie Hooper. Next, Rob Collister, who chaired a select committee into dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia and dysgraphia. And perhaps the best way to start would be for you to tell us what all of those things are and why you needed to have a select committee to look into this.
Well, this originally came from a petition on Tynwald Day. So it just shows that, when people make these petitions, Tynwald members do look at them. And this one caught my attention. And this is about learning differences. This is about making the system better. We know dyslexia is a very common one that people know. The others relate to, for example, numbers. But for me, the dyslexia one is one that really gets repeated time and time again. And if we actually can put the support in place early on, right at primary school, secondary school, and then going into college or university, this can help people, and this will make a massive difference to the Isle of Man, because if you capture it early, you support people early on, then hopefully what happens is they're not captured later on in adult life, which then becomes very difficult. And this is from somebody who does suffer from slight dyslexia. I do sometimes get my words mixed up, and I do get names mixed up, and I think I'm not alone with that. So to me, this has been a great achievement, and to work alongside Mrs. Kinnish and Mrs. Corlett on this committee has been absolutely fantastic. You have 3 Tynwald members who are really passionate about this topic, and hopefully that came through in the report. But it was also fascinating to speak to teachers who are on the front line dealing with this. You spoke to parents who really genuinely struggled to get the support for their children that they need. And we spoke to students who had been left behind, and then suddenly in their 20s and 30s trying to sort support to give them a meaningful life.
Why do all teachers need follow-up training? I mean, they all get training on this sort of thing. People with learning differences, this is part of the standard training procedures. So why do they need a compulsory update?
Well, I think all teachers need some training on this, because from our evidence and from our committee report, it is not consistent. So each school does it slightly different. Some children are being identified early and the support's given, some are not, and they're being missed. So what we're trying to do in this report is to make sure there is an element of consistency. So it doesn't matter where your child goes to school, it doesn't matter which parent is asking for support. If all of these 12 recommendations are implemented by the Department of Education and implemented in our schools and in our colleges, then hopefully people will receive that extra support they need. But more importantly, parents will not feel frustrated that some of their calls for more support and for teachers to be able to support them will not be overlooked. And you've got to remember, in this report, it does identify that teachers were very scared to identify children who may or may not have dyslexia. So we've got to build the confidence that teachers are able to assess students early on in preschool or even primary school, and then be able to pass that information on to secondary education and say this child will need a little bit more support. And even someone coming through secondary school going into university saying this child may need a little bit more support. It's about nurturing the support and nurturing the training and making sure that we capture this very early. And I'm so grateful to everyone in Tynwald for supporting these 12 recommendations. In fact, 11 of our recommendations was as printed on our report, which is fantastic. The only one that the Council of Ministers managed to actually get the amendment through was a recommendation 7, which relates to Senkos. And I think on that one, they will have a date in October 2027. But given everything else is now in December 2026, I hope the department will actually come back and give us an update on recommendation 7 in December and not just wait to the next year.
You've been through an electoral cycle. You know what happens when, by the time you get to the end of July, Tynwald, all the big decisions stop, and pretty much the political element of Isle of Man government grinds to a complete standstill. How is it going to be possible for the department to respond and bring a meaningful report, bearing in mind from July probably to mid-October, there'll be very little political action undertaken. So even if the officers are diligently carrying out bits of work, there's no political input really.
Well, if we just take that point, so what actually is going to happen is there are several of these recommendations that have now been approved in Tynwald, where the Department of Education is going to have to come back in December and give an update. So it's not the final report, it's not the finished article. What we're asking for, and what Tynwald's agreed today, is they will have to give a progress report. So the officers can work in the background, they can look at all of these recommendations and have the new minister in October, if it's not the current one, the new minister will actually be able to stand up in December and give a progress report about delivering these services around dyslexia and other learning differences. Now, by doing that, it is far better for the new administration to say this is still on the radar, this is the upgrade, the progress report. But if we didn't do that today, then we'd have to wait till October 2027 to get that progress. To me, that's set so far into the future that I think there will be children lost between now and October 2027. And what we're actually saying is we cannot afford to lose any more children due to the fact that they've not been identified as having dyslexia or dyscalculia or dyspraxia or dysgraphia. We've got to identify these signs earlier and give the support to them, because if not, it's another generation lost.
Do you think the government side would have been more successful if they'd have said something like February or March, April 27, given them a little bit more time, but not effectively a whole year and a quarter?
Well, if you look at several items that were on the Tynwald order paper this particular month, they've actually had, it seems to be October 2027 for everything. And I don't know if they just pulled a date out of a hat or something, because both items, or 2 or 3 items on the order paper, had October 2027. That's far too far into the future. Yes, we have a new administration coming in September, but on this report, to actually give that update within 2 months of a new administration, the members should be settled in. The officers will already be working on this over the summer period. It's absolutely right. Especially as I highlighted in this report, there are children being forgotten today. There are parents that need support today. Let's have that date of December 2026. All we're asking for is a progress report. And even if I'm not in the chamber in December 2026, I want to actually see that update. And I want to see the department implementing these recommendations as soon as possible, because that was the will of Tynwald. And even the minister said, absolutely agree with the recommendation. It's just the date they were unhappy with.
Well, what's the difference going to be? I mean, in terms of people, particularly parents of children who have these conditions, what are you hoping is going to have changed over the course of the next year or so?
Okay, so if these 12 recommendations are implemented as printed, and they are implemented as quickly as possible, what you'll find is that students going to school in the future will be identified early if they have dyslexia or dyscalculia, dyspraxia or dysgraphia. Then what we'll also have is better trained teachers. That's what they were asking for. So we're going to have better trained teachers. We'll also, and those teachers will have the confidence to be able to identify students with additional learning needs. We'll also have a system which then translates that from one school to the next. So they'll be passing on information to say this student needs extra support. So at the start of a new school, that student will already be identified that they need extra support. And if they go to, say, for example, the Alaman College and they have to do exams, that identification will already be there from the outset. It is going to be game-changing if we implement this correct. And you've got to remember from a society point of view, and I haven't got the figures with me, Phil, but if you actually look at it, there's a high percentage of people within our Isle of Man prison that have some form of dyslexia. Now, if we can capture that earlier, we could also be doing a major initiative for learning difficulties, and from a society's point of view, we'll pick these people up early and give them a proper opportunity to make a positive contribution to our society.
That was Onchan MHK Rob Collister. Back now to Laurie Hooper on budget reform. I think the principle that members have far more control and say over what's in the budget and how that works, I don't think many people would argue with that. But there were 25 recommendations, and I guess if I was a Treasury officer, I would be thinking to myself, this is an awful lot of additional work that I'm going to have to do. When am I going to have time to do the innovative thinking that's needed to get us out of the financial black hole that we have?
And I think that fundamentally confuses two issues. So it's not the Treasury's job to do that thinking. The Treasury should not be, and this is one of the questions the committee asked, is should Treasury be the people doing that kind of macroeconomic level of work? And the answer is probably not, actually. The Treasury are the people that are in control of the public purse. It's their job to safeguard our funds. But you run a risk there if Treasury's job is to do that, but also to grow the economy. Actually, they're conflicting objectives sometimes. So you need to hand some of that responsibility over to somebody else. And a lot of the reasons we have issues, and you see this time and time again, is Treasury getting too involved in the policy side of work. So, we need a new nursing care home in Ramsey. They had planning permission for years. The reason that that's taking so long is because Treasury have got involved asking questions like, are you sure it's the right site? Does it need to be that big? Well, hold on, they're questions that the health system has already answered, that the planning system has already answered. Why is Treasury getting involved in that level of detail? And that's where you have problems. And so maybe by forcing the Treasury to focus a bit more on the budget process and the budget itself, it will take them out of the weeds and be able to lift them up to some more of the bigger picture thinking that they're supposed to be doing. But equally, I think I'd be looking at this as an opportunity. I mean, this is 15 years of budget reform crammed into a single sitting of Tynwald, essentially. And maybe if the Treasury had been more open to incremental and gradual reform, we wouldn't be in this position of saying, well, now you've got 25 recommendations to deal with. Maybe they could have done it more incrementally. And I suspect what will happen is they will come back in the next administration and propose an incremental, gradual set of changes, because doing this as a big bang may not be the best thing for the island. You are going to change your budget, you're going to open it up to a bit more public scrutiny, a bit more public involvement. I think all those things are really positive. But you want to make sure it works. What I would hate to see is them rush these changes, it not work, and then be able to people point back and go, well, we should never have done it, and then undoing all of that, some of which I think will be really positive. So I do think it's going to be an incremental change. I think it's going to be gradual, but I think it is moving in the right direction, because at the moment the idea that the budget is published and then it's voted on the same day, it doesn't give members or the public any chance to properly scrutinise it, to understand what's coming in it, to take advice from people who know more than they do, from experts, from the finance sector, from small businesses. We've no idea what their thoughts are, because the budget is announced and then it is voted on, by the end of the debate. And I think the idea that we have a bit more time to do that and a bit more influence over the process, I think it's going to be a positive change, but it needs to be done in the right way. I wouldn't advocate rushing through. So from a Treasury officer perspective, I think they can take a deep breath and look at how we're going to do this in the right way, rather than trying to rush it through just to meet some deadlines that Tynwald has set.
And I think significantly, the first budget that this is going to impact on is the 2028 budget, as I understand.
Yeah, I would assume so, because I would assume that going into the 27th budget just after an election cycle, there's not going to be a lot of space to make big sweeping changes. They might be able to make some changes to that process by that time, but actually it will be 2028, I would imagine. I think some of the changes may even need us to change the law, so there'll be plenty of time to debate and move that in the next House, whoever's bringing it forward. I mean, whoever is the next Treasury Minister is going to have a big job ahead of them to try and make sure that this is all done in a measured and sensible way, but actually without losing some of the core parts of what the committee was trying to recommend.
And one of the aspects of this is public engagement, and we have in the last week or so had an initiative by two individuals in Russian to actually get the public out and talk without politicians present about what their priorities are. And of course the thing with the budget is at the moment, a week or two in advance, the public only finds out on budget day, and by that time it's too late for them to assess, get their feedback in, and tell you what they think by the time you have to vote.
Yeah, it is a serious weakness of our political process here, that because we don't have that kind of embedded party set up, that you are entirely reliant on the government doing all these things. If we were in a better place, what you'd end up doing is having more meaningful engagement on your policy objectives, aims, priorities through whichever party you're a member of, and then they would be able to effectively or more effectively represent your interests than in Tynwald, because they'd have a much better idea of the direction of travel, of where they stood on things. As it stands at the moment, it's difficult, I think, to get real good feel, because you can't talk to the public about the budget. We may get it a few weeks in advance, but I can't talk to everybody about it. And not knowing what the public generally are trying to do is trying to ask us for, it can be quite difficult. The budget itself, though, is a very high-level document. It's very big picture, and it should be about gradually steering the ship. It shouldn't be about veering from one set of policies to another. And so whatever changes you end up with in a budget are always going to be incremental. They're always going to be gradual, and that's a good thing. I don't think you want the kind of chaos of a budget being completely different to last year. You do want things to be moved gradually. Where I think public engagement will help is actually better informing the government about how to make sure the budget is aligned with other things government have said. So government publish an economic strategy, or they publish a healthcare strategy or a childcare strategy, and then none of that really seems to chime with what's in the budget, and the budget sometimes can directly contradict some of that stuff. And I think that's where there will be some real benefit in the public engaging more, because there will be members of the public who are really interested in the additional educational needs code, or they'll be really interested in whatever a particular aspect of the budget really matters to them, and they will be the ones saying, hold on a second, you approved a strategy for this 2 years ago, but there's no money for it, why not? And that's where I think that some added scrutiny from the public will help, because it'll help government, I think, take a step back and realise that it's making these promises, these commitments to people, and then isn't properly funding them. And if you're making unfunded promises, what are they worth? And the answer is not a lot.
Ramsey MHK Laurie Hooper there. There was a meeting held in Russian to assess public opinion in the run-up to the general election. I spoke to the organisers.
Janet Bridle.
And Lulu Gillow. We organised a public meeting for the constituency of Russian, but everyone was invited. So just so that give people the opportunity to say what they think was priorities for the next incoming administration. And we've said this before, but just to underscore that we wanted it to be looked to be seen as a supportive action. And we had over 70 people here this evening. We split it into 4 groups, and we just gave them the opportunity to say what they think should be the priorities for the incoming next set of MHKs.
And Janet, you were scribing for one of the groups. I mean, what were the... well, I don't know, do you want to talk at this stage about any of the issues, or how did you find the scribing process?
Yes, that's a better question. I found the scribing really interesting. It's so interesting what people have to say. It's so interesting the way commonalities just keep coming up. And we all have those same concerns, and people want to talk about them, and they also have solutions, which is great. But it is a very, very interesting process, and I think the whole island needs to do it.
And one of the reasons that I know you're loath to go into detail at this stage is because you're still compiling all the feedback, and you want to tell us what are you going to do with that feedback?
Yeah, so the next stage of the process is that each 4 of the scribes will put all those notes together, and we're going to put it into a document. We were hoping the idea, rather perhaps foolishly at the end, we were going to get people to vote on what they thought was the top priorities, but I think that's coming through. And then what we'll do, we'll put a document together, possibly aligning it to the most important priority and whatever, and then we'll get that published in the press, and we'll make sure that anyone who's declared, anyone who will declare, anybody who's of interest will have a copy of that.
And you've taken email addresses from anyone who was willing to put their email address down, and effectively the document is shared in a draft with them. Is that how it's worked?
Yes, we're going to write it up, share it as a draft, so that they have the opportunity to have a look at it, to make sure we've got it right. Because we want to be as upfront and clear and transparent as possible.
And there was a suggestion that maybe there would be an opportunity to vote through email. Is that?
Yeah, well, the other thing we said at the end, that is because we didn't get a chance to vote on what people might have thought was a top priority. So we have offered them the opportunity that once they've seen the draft of the document, that they might want to say what their own priorities were. We also offered paper, so that if people wanted to write their comments down, if they feel they didn't get a chance to speak, or perhaps we feel a bit anxious to speak, because sometimes in big groups people don't like to do that. So we're hoping that we've covered all bases on that we've given people as many opportunities within this process to tell us what their thoughts are.
And by the end of this year, after we've had a newly elected House of Keys, what do you hope that this exercise might have achieved?
Well, as I said, we hope it's supportive. We see it as doing some primary research. They will be knocking on doors and what have you. But we really hope that we will empower our MHKs to feel that we're behind them. One of the things that's come through in the comments, certainly that Janet and I have had when we've been going around publicising this, is that I think people do realise that change is needed. And one of the things we'd like to say is, we voted you in. Please be brave and make the changes that perhaps we know you need to make.
One of the things that was noticed by some of the people here this evening was that there weren't that many young people.
I know, that was disappointing because, excuse me, when we went around the local communities, we did actually speak to quite a few younger people, and there was a lot of enthusiasm for this, and a lot of them said, "Oh yes, no, we'll be there." So it would be good for younger people to have their thing. We must find a way. Maybe perhaps somebody can come up with a suggestion where we can reach out to
social media.
The dreaded social media. Yes.
I have to say though that those people who are here after we're chatting, that almost everyone came up to one of us to thank us for giving them this opportunity. And I think certainly the demographic of the people who are here are probably the people who prefer to do this in person. So yes, perhaps possibly online for the younger people. But I think people did really appreciate the opportunity. Well, that's certainly what I came with. You're aware of that too. Yeah.
Janet Bridle and Lulu Gillow there. Next, Health Minister Claire Christian. You were quite particular in when it was suggested that you'd said there were enough beds. Actually, you were saying, well, no, I don't think I have said that. What I've said, well, you tell me. What were you saying?
So I was repeating what the report found. The report found that at this point, that putting in more beds wouldn't necessarily be the right answer, and the right answer is to look at the flow and the efficiencies within not just the hospital, and that's what we really have to think about here, that this is about all the way through to from the GPs all the way through to discharge, and it's about getting that right flow, and there's lots of recommendations about how we can enhance that efficiency. Do that first. We're also still doing the CDU, and we're also still implementing the
CDU,
the clinical decision unit. Thank you, Phil. The clinical decision unit, which was the 12 space unit within the emergency department. So those things are still going ahead, but most importantly, it's the efficiency and the productivity that within the hospital and within our GPs. And as I said. Yesterday, there are some really, really good examples. So, for example, right now, we work on a 5-day discharge. So that's during the week. And what the recommendation is that we move to a 7-day discharge, so that there's discharges happening on the weekend as well, so that we don't have that backup come on Monday and Tuesday morning. And that's quite a simple thing. But Manx Care now have to look at implementing that. Working with the frontline staff, seeing if they'll be willing to work with working plans to be able to achieve that, and then obviously there might be a cost to that as well. So we've got to look at that within our framework and within our budget.
And of course, therein lies part of the problem, because of course the other thing you've been hitting the headlines for this week is the £19 million supplementary vote that was required to back up the budget that had been approved for the last financial year. And effectively, from my reading of the report, and maybe I haven't read it in as much detail as you have, the report seemed to be suggesting that it's not so much that there isn't a potential need for more beds, but within the budgets that you have available, you can't increase just opening more beds without all the procedures that go behind that to ensure that the beds are being operated and used safely is not going to be possible. And at the same time, you are constrained in terms of the budget. Many people, I think, will be wondering, well, how come the budget for healthcare has been increased by something like 50% over the last 5 years or so? How come we seem to be ending up in the position that we have, with more money, less beds, and longer waiting lists?
Yeah, I think that's the exam question, isn't it, Phil? It's really important that we're able to demonstrate that what has been in the last 5 years, and I've only been part of the last 18 months, but over the last 5 years, what we have done to improve services and to and how the demand has grown. And obviously the public will hear things like, an ageing population and each person has different multiple needs now rather than singular needs. And these are real factors, but we're not great at communicating that. But also we have added a lot of services. You think about MCALs, that's a brand new service. And we've increased budgets within the mental health area and things like that. So we really do need to start communicating that. I'm looking at, in July, at bringing more information to the public about what we've achieved in these 5 years, or what Manx Care have achieved. And I think that would be really, really important and helpful for them, because from their perspective, they're seeing this dichotomy, exactly what you're saying. I don't feel like I'm getting more for my money, more for this, what taxpayers' money is being spent on. But you'll have to obviously think about the costs of our staff. It's about 80%. We have to pay them in comparator to the UK. That is a big cost in terms of the organisation. And we have over 3,000 employees. So there are these other areas that we really do need to make sure that the public understand that, so that when we do come back, and we have come back, and yesterday the supplementary vote was supported, because we were very, very, very clear from the outset, when I first became minister, that there were unfunded areas within the budget that we were allocated. And that was not a surprise then for members in coming and asking for this supplementary vote. We throughout that year, we have obviously had those decisions where we could have reduced elective surgery, but that would have increased waiting times and things like that. That's not decisions that I felt that we should be taking. We had highlighted that these were areas that needed more funding. We had to see if those risks were going to transpire throughout the year. And they did, Phil. They did transpire.
And one of the suggestions that was made is maybe you should have come back sooner. Maybe you should have come back during the year and said, look, we are, as we predicted, we're going to overspend in all these areas. Tynwald, what do you want us to do?
Yeah, I think there's definitely an opportune moment to be able to do that, and it's the way that the budget process works. Yes, we could have probably come back with some areas where we could have highlighted, but that some of those risks don't come to fruition till later on at the end of the year. And that can be down to things like, I spoke yesterday about transformation funding. So we didn't really get that till, I think it was December. So the GIRFT didn't action. So it meant that we weren't able to make those savings in the cost improvement programme. So yeah, we definitely can be more quicker in how we do things, or in terms of coming to Tynwald and keeping them abreast of it. But we do obviously publish Manx Care do publish their annual their accounts, monthly accounts. So it's ongoing. The public can see that.
The other thing during the debate into assisted dying, you pointed out that in response to a point raised by Tim Glover, that you would be bringing back to Tynwald before the end of this parliamentary season, which basically means July, I guess, a report into funding for hospice.
Yes, so we have been working really closely with hospice, and I thank the hospice for being really open and transparent and working with us over the past couple of months. So we are now looking at this in the department. We're waiting for the report to come, I'm hoping in the next couple of weeks, which should be a policy report that will recommend what funding the government should be giving to the hospice. And then I will then take that to the Council of Ministers and bring that to Tynwald. And I'm hoping that I will get the support. And that is an example, Phil, as you have quite rightly just said, there's something that we can bring in year and actually say, we didn't get enough budget for this, or we did get enough budget. But we need to obviously take those steps, and I'm committed to doing that, and committed to working with the hospice and making sure that we have a plan for the next 3 to 5 years, so that they get that assurance.
Is part of this whole debate an inevitable backlash against the cultural change, which effectively was what Manx Care was brought in to deliver? We had a system which was very much healthcare was in the hands of politicians. Political involvement was far greater in terms of the day-to-day operation of healthcare, and maybe in the past, that healthcare system was very, very effective at doing certain things, but not so effective at doing other things. And to try and alter the sort of the balance, maybe this is why people are starting to notice things like there are fewer beds available in Nobles Hospital, because that cultural change has required us to focus on other elements.
So I think you're right. I think Manx Care have definitely provided that separation that was needed at the time. And we spoke about this before, Phil, where I've said that they're still in an inception phase, and we shouldn't be, I think, in my opinion, since I've been working with Manx Care, be leaving them so much on their own. They, for example, the single patient record, which is a really, really important piece of IT that we absolutely need, that really affects the public. I hear from the public saying, "Oh, I've had to speak to my doctor. They haven't got this from my consultant, or they haven't got this." Is so that's what that is about, the single patient record, and that is mostly out of the remit and the control of Manx Care. That's government that has to, come up with that, work with that, deliver that, and we have to be much, much quicker in responding and being able to do that. So that's something very much is my focus. It's a real priority for me over the next coming months, even though we have obviously a busier period for other reasons, Phil, but I won't take my eye off the ball when this is going on, because I still need to make sure that we progress with these areas, because that really affects people, and that really affects also our staff. The fact that they have to log on 7 different systems within the hospital, that shouldn't be happening. We should be having a modern healthcare system that will really support those consultants and the doctors and the nurses to be able to do their job effectively.
That was Douglas South MHK Claire Christian. Finally, former Health Minister Laurie Hooper again. How is it that despite everything that you have said as Health Minister, the current Health Minister has said, how are we still having these significant overspends?
So if you look back at this year at least, and you look back at some of the remarks that were made by a number of us, Manx Care were pretty upfront about the budget. They said at the start of the year, if you look in the mandate, they were quite clear. They had a list of things that were not included in that budget. The patient transfer to the UK wasn't included. There were some vaccinations that weren't included. A big list of stuff. And yet the government wanted them to do it anyway. So this was at the start of the year when the budget was approved. Manx Care and the Health Minister were very open and said, you're giving us £360 million, and for that we'll be able to do all this. You've also asked us to do these things which are not covered by the budget. We're going to be overspent. And so it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that at the end of the year they're overspent, because we asked them to go and do that stuff. The missing part of the puzzle is the government has never come back to Tynwald and said, right, so you've approved the budget for 360, these things are not going to be funded in that, do you want us to fund them or not? And I think if you'd have asked that question, I suspect Tynwald would have said, no, we do think we should fund those things, because they're important. But because we've never had that discussion, what happens instead is at the end of the year, the government is too afraid to actually make change. So at the end of the year, we come back and they say, right, we delivered all the things you asked for, and it cost us more than we were given. And we told you that at the outset, so we're going to need you to stump up and pay the bill. And that's the reality of healthcare on the island, is every year, at least since I've been here, the government has been told how much the health service needs to deliver what's being asked of it. And every year, the government Treasury response is essentially, that's nice, but have a different amount of money. Okay, so what do you want us to cut? What services do you want us to cut? What do you want to reduce? And the answer is nothing. Politicians don't like that. Okay, fine, we're going to save some of it through efficiencies. Manx Care have managed to save £10 million a year, I think, give or take, which has always been more than they've been asked to save. They're the only government department that has done that. The only part of government that has been asked to save a certain amount of money, and every single year has saved more than they've been asked to save. In fact, they've saved more this year than the rest of government combined. So they are doing that.
That's easy though when you have one of the, well, undoubtedly the largest budget across all departments. It's easy to make a 2% saving and then find that that's a big amount of money compared with some of the smaller departments where a similar percentage would be significantly less money.
I don't disagree, but if the rest of government had also done 2%, it would have been twice what Manx Care had saved. So Manx Care's budget is 400 odd million. We spend 1.something billion a year. So if the rest of government had saved 2%, you're right, individually the departments would have individually saved less, but collectively they would have saved more. And the reality is the whole of government has managed to save £4 million outside of Manx Care. Manx Care has managed to save 10 by themselves. So I think they're doing okay in terms of the saving side of things. But the reality that I think a lot of people won't accept is there is only so much you can squeeze out of the system, because ultimately healthcare costs are quite high in terms of the fixed cost base. You know, you need a certain number of doctors and nurses, and you need them whether you're treating 5 people or 50 people. And that's the system we've got. We have those quite high fixed costs. So you're never really going to get away from that. So can they be more efficient? Can they see more people? Can they? Absolutely, they can do all those things. But can they extract more cash out of the system? I think that the answer to that question is far more complicated, and I suspect the answer is only to a limited extent. So we've got a system that is extracting as much cash out as it can. It's trying to be as efficient as possible, and even on top of that, they're being told by government, that's nice, but you need to do more because we're not going to fund all the services we're asking you to deliver. And I think that's the bit of the puzzle that no one has found a way of answering, because if we were to fund them properly in terms of asking them to do 100 things and funding those 100 things, and they then come in over budget, that's definitely a different conversation. But until we've done that, it's very hard to know whether the problem is, are we under budgeting or are they overspending? And it's very difficult to answer that question whilst every year we're not funding the things we're asking them to deliver. And so, like I said in my speech, none of this came as a surprise. The things that they said they were overspent on were all the things at the start of the year they said, we're going to be overspent on these things unless you fund them. And I think that's probably the bit of the conversation that needs to happen, is government needs to sit down and have an honest conversation with the public about, right, if you don't want to spend this money on healthcare, we can change what we're doing, we can change the funding model, we can, but actually that is going to result in an impact on frontline services. And I'm not sure anybody wants that. I mean, we had a debate discussion this morning about weight loss drugs and how they should be available on the NHS. Well, that's more things that's going to have to be funded. I've got no issue with having those conversations and those debates about what should be funded and what shouldn't be funded, about what services we should and shouldn't deliver. But where I have a bit of an issue is where we're asking the service to go away and do 100 things and only paying them to do 90, and then complaining of them that they've spent money on the 10 things which we never funded in the first place. And I think that is a very different conversation to, oh no, they're overspent again. Okay, they could very well have overspent in some areas, but the core issue is we're giving them a mandate to do things that we're not funding them to do. And like I said in my remarks, fair play to the Minister. I did it when I was in post. I was quite honest that we weren't being paid for everything. The Minister's gone a step further and actually put that down in the mandate and inside the operating plan directly. So I don't think anyone can accuse Manx Care of hiding the reality here. They've been very upfront about the likely impact, and I don't know whether this year will be any different.
Laurie Hooper there. So what do you think? How is it so difficult to keep health spending in check? Will we see any difference from the new budget proposals? Are you encouraged by more support for people with dyslexia? Let me know your thoughts on the programme by contacting Phil Gorn at manxradio.com and get in touch if you have any ideas for future shows. Don't forget this programme is available as a podcast. I'm Phil Gorn. Go to Thanks for listening.